This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. Last week, I was on the highway for the first time since the state shut down in mid-March. I didn't miss I-91. I'm one of the lucky ones with a job and an employer that allow me to work from home during the pandemic. As Connecticut opens back up, will telecommuting continue to be an option for local workers? And later we'll talk about public transit. Usage is down despite essential workers, including grocery store and daycare employees, still needing to get to their jobs. Will usage go up in the next few months, or will people worry about if it's safe to board a bus or train with the coronavirus still around us? We also want to hear from you. Were you able to telecommute, and do you hope you'll be able to continue working from home? If you rely on mass transit, are you confident cities and towns will continue to invest in it if ridership remains low? As always, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I want to welcome into the show, or on the show, on Zoom today, Russell McDermott, Program Director for CT Rides. It's a free program of the State Department of Transportation to help commuters find other options to get to work or school beyond driving solo. Russell, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for having me.
So tell us more about CT Rides. Many of us have been able to telecommute over the last 3 months. But when you talk about the program and the aims of trying to get commuters to look at other options besides driving.
Yeah, definitely. So we're a statewide commuter services program. Like you said, we're a program of the Connecticut DOT. And our main goal is to reduce traffic congestion and improve air quality within the state. So by doing that, we work with different audiences. We work with commuters by helping them find the best way to get to work or school other than driving alone. And we also work with employers by helping them to provide customized worksite solutions that helps them with their commuting and transportation challenges. Because when we're talking about commuting and transportation, it's really important to look at both sides of the coins. So you have the commuters, the employees that drive to and from work and schools and other institutions. And you have the employers themselves, who's the gateway to those employees.
Can you give me an idea before the pandemic, how many state residents or employers were teleworking?
So in Connecticut, prior to the pandemic, we were a little bit above the national average. So you had about 5.6% of people in Connecticut were actually teleworking. And the national average, I think, is closer to 5.34. But prior to that, there was a pretty steady increase in the popularity with teleworking. I mean, just in the past, I think 15 or so years, it's grown over 170%, which is a massive number when you put it in context and think about the scale of it. So teleworking was definitely on the rise prior to COVID-19.
I want to bring into the conversation now on the phone David Lewis. He's CEO of Operations Inc., which is a statewide human resources consulting firm. David, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Lucy. Good to be here.
So tell us about your company, Operations Inc. And I should mention before we talk more that Connecticut Public is our parent company, and our HR department has actually a contract with Operations Inc. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, tell us more about Operations Inc. and how you've embraced teleworking even prior to this pandemic.
Sure. So we started in 2001 in the home office I'm sitting in right now, and the we was just me. My foray into the consulting business was preceded by a series of employment relationships that allowed me to work remotely. And so when I opened the company back then, it was something that I knew I was comfortable with, and I embraced and grew the business on the basis of using a team of remote people, which helped me keep my costs down for the first several years and didn't put us into a formal office until 5 years later. And so now, in our 20th year, we've been a very strong voice in the area of managing remote work and helping our clients navigate that. And it certainly has become very handy given everything that people have been forced into as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak.
When you mentioned keeping costs down, so you're not having to rent office space or figuring out where your employees will be parking when they're working, David?
Yeah, it started off with, just having a large enough home where I actually was able to have a few employees come here and work in the home office with me. But technology is as such where it's not just recent. It's been for a while that the combination of laptop computing and internet access and even voice over IP telephones makes it very easy for businesses to be able to operate on a remote level. And where there are a lot of companies that adopted that approach years ago, many of them were forced into it for the first time in the last 3-4 months and have come to realize that this is not nearly as difficult as they anticipated, and more importantly, that their employees are embracing it in a very significant way.
Mm-hmm. And like many other office workers around the state, when the pandemic hit, your workforce were you able to easily, again, transition to all of your staff working remotely?
Yeah, this was probably the simplest of all of the companies we're working with and interacting with. We had the easiest time of making this transition because, probably 60% of our staff works at one time or another from home. So moving the other 40% into remote work was not all that difficult. And we've continued to maintain an effective and efficient and a productive environment, even though we're not physically putting ourselves in our corporate headquarters in Norwalk each day as we normally would have.
You're hearing on the phone David Lewis, CEO of Operations, Inc., a statewide human resources consulting firm. Also with us on Zoom is Russell McDermott, Program Director for CT Rides. As we talk about the future of work today, will telecommuting continue even after this pandemic is over? We also want to hear about your experience transitioning to telecommuting, if you were able to do so with your job. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. David, I mentioned, again, you are helping other companies figure out how to do this teleworking, telecommuting. And so I'm just wondering what kind of questions you got from companies that had to shift that weren't like Operations Inc., where they didn't have a majority of staff teleworking or telecommuting.
Yeah, so the challenges started certainly with things that no one who's done telecommuting and done it effectively ever anticipated, which was just how to be productive when you're home and you're not home alone, but instead you're home with your kids and with your spouse or your significant other or with your roommates. So, the mindset that we really tried to get our clients to focus on sort of pivoted to a 12 for 8 approach. Ask your employees to focus on a 12-hour window of time during the course of a given day to achieve 8 hours worth of work. And that really seemed to resonate and be effective because what it meant was that you were essentially telling the employee who's parenting and homeschooling 2 kids that it's okay to take off a half an hour between 10:30 and 11 and help their kids. It's okay to take an hour off to give them lunch and play outside with them and to sort of have better balance. The stress associated with this experience has been, in many cases, unbearable and something no one ever anticipated. But when you add into it the idea of trying to juggle, this has been truly the meaning of work-life balance. And so the clients that embraced that approach early were the ones that really earned a lot of respect from their employees and didn't see much in the way of a drop of productivity out of their teams, despite the circumstances we all found ourselves in.
Russell, I'm wondering if you could chime in as well, because we've been working as Program Director for CT Rides. What did you hear from employers that had to make this switch?
Well, like David said, I think the biggest transition for companies was just the scope of what was going on and having to, transition their entire organizations in many cases to having to work from home remotely. And then on top of that, when you look at the stress that their employees have with, in essence, most people having 2 jobs from going from, just working, doing your regular job and now being parents or in some cases dependent care. So, companies were really just trying to figure out how can I do this? Even companies who had existed in remote work programs, they were having trouble scaling up just, again, due to the size and the complexity, whether it's from a policy or agreement standpoint or from a technology standpoint. So it was just trying to figure out how can we do this effectively and efficiently. And one of the things that we've been telling to companies is really to use this as a look at this like a pilot program. Use it to examine your existing remote work policy, adjust where needed, and most importantly is be understanding. Again, there are going to be challenges when you're doing this, especially on the scope and the scale where that companies are having to look at this now. But be understanding with your employees. Life is going to happen. Again, this is not an ideal scenario. And I think the companies who go into that with that open mind, work on the best practices like communication skills between the managers and employers, they're starting to find their footing. And like David said, I think maintain or in some cases increase that level of productivity that they were seeing prior to this.
David, I wanted to ask, of the employers that that have a contract with your company, was there some feedback from bosses who were worried about that productivity because, again, they're not able to see their employees? And obviously they don't want their employees on the computer 8 hours a day straight, but at the same time worried about what this means in terms of getting the job done.
And so you make a great point, Lucy, in that, before COVID-19, when we were dealing with companies who were looking to start a remote work program or who were trying to figure out why the program they had in place was not working for them, the one thing that we'd always find is that managers could just not get comfortable with the idea of managing from a distance. And think about who we, in that circumstance before COVID-19, when we had an option of who to allow to work from home, who we would pick. We'd pick people that were responsible, that demonstrated the ability to operate independently, that were self-driven, that didn't need micromanagement. And yet so many companies send people like that home and forget all of those qualities seemingly overnight and start getting paranoid about the idea that the person, when they're not responding immediately to my email or to my instant message, must be watching soap operas or doing their laundry or playing with their kids or cooking dinner early, that they're not productive. And so that's one of the biggest concerns we try to get ahead of with clients, is to make them first reminded of who they usually have selected when it's been their choice. But getting past that now, since COVID-19, focus on how to manage from a metrics perspective, focus on how to judge the performance of the individual, not just based on what you're seeing in front of you, but what you're getting as far as output is concerned. And then to pivot to your other point, major concern about how people really need training themselves on how to unplug, that the employee themselves, their desk, per se, may very well also be their kitchen table. And we're not used to folding up our office and putting it somewhere else in another place in our house, so we can now return to our house being our house. We're living at work right now, and that's the problem, is that companies have to also help their employees find the right balance where, it's great you're working 50 or 60 hours a week where you were working 35 before, but that's a recipe for disaster as well.
But when we talk also about helping employees work effectively from home, David, issues that employers run into where maybe not everyone has as you mentioned, they don't have the spare room to make an office. They might be working at the kitchen table, or maybe they have roommates, or they have issues with internet connectivity, and having to work through some of that with their employees.
Yeah, I think that what we've learned through this process is that all home offices are not made or created equal. And in many cases, people have found out that they don't have a desk height surface to work at, that they never really thought about ergonomics or about having a chair with arms, and how some of the components that we take for granted that are present in an office space, it's not just about having an internet connection and a laptop computer and a cell phone. It's much more than that. So it's going to have a significant lasting impact, in my opinion, on how people even just look at home shopping and how we look at how our homes are laid out. And I think where, I grew up, where the extra bedroom in a house was it was the guest room. Now that room is going to be more identified and identifiable as the location for a home office, or you'll hear a home office location be referenced as multiple possible places. But remember, we didn't have time to plan for this, and a lot of people, it's one thing to sit at your kitchen counter and throw your laptop there and, read emails for a couple of hours. It's an entirely different scenario when you're sitting there for 10 hours a day and trying to be productive and healthy in the process.
Again, you can join our conversation. We want to hear how your telecommuting experience has been over the last several months. The number 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. What about company culture? Because you're not able, I think most people would say that they're tired of having their Zoom meetings or Microsoft meetings where they're doing conferencing during the day. And it's not the same thing as when you're in an office space and you're just working off ideas off each other, and there's that camaraderie among staff. How do you work through that, David?
It's really tough, and I think what you're going to see is, so companies have done everything they possibly can to leverage all of this video technology, so much so that I would argue it's made a lot of our telephones obsolete, because I'm more used to now talking to people by looking at a camera on my computer versus doing so picking up the phone. That's a good start, and I think companies are going to look for ways to leverage that. But I think what we're going to see is you're going to see a big push on the tech side with all of the firms that are players within this video conferencing space, those that are wannabe players, who are going to try and figure out how to make more of the groups type of arrangement and connectivity something that's a part of the way we communicate on a remote level. I have my doubts and my concerns, and maybe that's just showing my age, because it's very much new and it feels a little bit too foreign to try and figure out how I take what happens around a water cooler or over the wall of a cubicle or in the hallway in a casual conversation that generates some great ideas and insight. How do I convert that somehow into something that's going to happen on my computer screen and through a set of headphones? I don't know. It feels very difficult, but I will tell you, we're going to see more tools in that direction, because in the battle between the desire for companies to have a productive culture replicated on the remote level versus the battle for employees to maintain this remote work relationship, the remote workers are going to win this hands down. Companies are going to have to figure out how to make the culture come through the computer screen and come through the headphones versus saying this isn't going to work, we need you all back here.
Nancy on Twitter asks, what about the additional expenses for employees working at home? Daytime AC or heating costs, printer paper, electricity bills. Will that be something that employers, David, have to consider in terms of reimbursing staff who are working more from home?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's, you've got a lot of factors that now employers are going to have to consider. I would venture a guess that if it hasn't already started to pop up, and it has for some companies, but it's not widespread yet, companies are going to go ahead and provide some level of a stipend to their employees for remote work. But, that's a big step, and it may have, ramifications around things like insurance that companies are going to have to explore and think through. So, I work at home, and I work at home even 1 day a week, let alone 5 days a week. What happens if I'm not, sitting in a chair that's ergonomically correct and I wind up with a back or a neck injury or carpal tunnel? If I'm also being given money for that setup, does that essentially translate into more liability ownership by the employer? That's a concern. But I think it's a great point. I know my electric bill is much higher right now, and it's going to be much higher this summer because normally I'd have my air conditioning off or mostly off throughout the day, and now working from home, it's going to be on the entire time. So this is a big factor that businesses are going to have to consider. They'll still save a lot of money long term because they won't have as much square footage that they're going to need to have going forward, but this is a factor.
I want to thank David Lewis for joining us here on Where We Live. Again, he's CEO of Operations, Inc., a statewide human resources consulting firm. David, before we go, now that Connecticut's already in phase 2 or soon will be, are you hearing from more employers that want to continue with telecommuting?
I am, and candidly, in many cases right now, it's because of two factors. One, because their employees seem to like it and are reluctant to do a public commute. And then the second factor, which is significant that I've been talking a lot about very publicly, is that the Reopen Connecticut program that's been issued by the state has some significant gaps in it that doesn't make it safe in the eyes of a lot of business owners to bring their employees back. And until they fill those gaps, a lot of companies are going to continue to operate remotely at least through the summer until those safety gaps are closed.
Briefly, can you tell us what some of those gaps are?
So the biggest concern is that the state didn't put any onus on landlords and building management companies to meet certain standards associated with safety. And my big pet peeve is the bathrooms. Bathrooms are not space that I control as a tenant. The landlord does. And there are no standards in the Reopen Connecticut program that specifically call for things like social distancing in a bathroom or posting of signs to remind people of certain types of protocols for safety. And that area, to me, is the area that my employees are most easily going to get exposed to COVID-19 by others. And yet that area is not being addressed for reasons that are just unclear to me and other business leaders in the Reopen Connecticut plan. And the second piece is there's no clear path for how a building, an entire building, would get notified in the event somebody tests positive for COVID-19. And if I'm bringing my employees through a lobby, an elevator, a stairwell, and those same bathrooms, in contact with other employees from other companies, I should have the assurance that if somebody tests positive that's been in the building, we'll be notified so we can alert our employees and have them have a safe go-forward plan. That, too, is not being committed to by the state, and I am fighting very fervently with the administration in an effort to get them to correct those gaps.
Well, we hope to bring those up with Governor Lamont. We've been trying to have the governor on frequently here on Where We Live. David Lewis, thank you for bringing up those points with us here on the show.
My pleasure.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. On Zoom with us is Russell McDermott. He's going to stay with us. He's Program Director for CT Rides. Again, it's a free program of the State Department of Transportation to help commuters find other options beyond driving solo to get to work or school. Coming up, the number of drivers and ridership across all modes of transportation have dropped dramatically with stay-at-home orders. Will Connecticut beginning to reopen? What will the new commute look like? We're going to talk more about that. We want to hear from you. Also, their emissions have gone down. What does that mean for the future in terms of encouraging more bicycling and other ways of getting around our state? Join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about telecommuting today after so many workers in Connecticut and nationwide shifted to working from home when the pandemic began. Now, as Connecticut and other states open back up, will more companies continue to offer telecommuting to its staff? And what are the advantages and disadvantages to remote work? Is this something you want to see continue? Join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Russell McDermott is with us on Zoom. He's Program Director for CT Rides. One of the goals of CT Rides, Russell, is to continue to reduce emissions while helping employees get back to work and promoting telework policies. I'm just wondering what has been the impact on shared transit options and what does that mean for the future?
Well, I think while we've seen telework and having a boom lately, unfortunately, there's been a corresponding decline in the number of people using public transportation. And when we start talking about the environment and congestion mitigation, I mean that's a very tough pill for us to swallow. We need to be aware of the fact that the current infrastructure, we need public transit. It's not a matter of whether, what the future will look like with or without it, but public transportation is something we need. Our infrastructure simply just cannot support all of the all of those people who are currently using public transit or used it before to shift to a drive alone commute. So what the future looks like, I think that's that's the $1 million question right now. But I think it's important for us to keep pushing for these other options, like continuing to telework whenever applicable. We need to make sure that in order for people to return to public transit, that they feel safe. And I think once they start to feel safe, then we'll start to see that increase again in the usage of public transportation. Because especially here in Connecticut, we had a really good story to tell prior to COVID-19. We had some really great services come online in the past few years, such as the CT Fast Track, the new CT Rail Hartford line, and we were seeing year over year ridership increases on both services. So we know that we have a proof of concept. We have a model that works. We've shown the state that if you build it, people will ride it. So, I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we continue to do the safety things that we've been doing on transit to let people know when it is safe that they can return.
When we talk about the different modes of transportation, often people focus on train commuters, many of them holding white-collar jobs. When we think about people who've been using CT Fast Track or even the city buses around the state, Russell, these bus commuters have less options. They may not have a car, but they may have an essential job they need to get to.
Exactly. So now we're talking about equity. When we are talking about transportation and public transportation in particular, one of the things we should also look at it or frame the conversation around is our economy as well. Public transportation is the backbone of our economy, and now that we're talking about a lot of the folks who may be dependent on those bus services to get to work. A lot of those people are now the essential workers that are going to the stores and the places that are reopening and keeping Connecticut going. So a lot of them really don't have any other option except for the buses and some of the trains in some of those instances. So it's incumbent on us to make sure that we keep those services available for these people. Not only so they can get back and forth to work, but again, so we can keep our economy going. So I think we really need to start looking at how we have this conversation. And when we're talking about transportation and public transportation, we're also talking about our economy and our future as well.
You can join our conversation on Where We Live. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Anthony's calling in from Hartford. Anthony, you're on the show.
Hello. My comment was in kind of a question, is seeing how effective telecommuting can be at reducing congestion. I'm very interested in seeing Connecticut DOT and the state legislators and the governor work to cancel the plans to expand both 84 and 95 at the state's boundaries. Over a third of the state's greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation, and those are both tremendously expensive projects. So I'd love to hear thoughts on that as we think about what our future looks like after this very informative disruption.
Thank you, Anthony, for your call. Russell, tell us more about how the Connecticut DOT, again, CT Rides is part of the Connecticut DOT, but ways to think about easing congestion, improving and encouraging more mass transit options.
Well, I think that was a great comment from the caller. I think when we look at the issue and we're talking about transportation, we need to have a holistic view of it. So we can't just look at it from a construction standpoint or even just a public transportation standpoint. We have to take into all the modes into consideration. So, drive alone is obviously the way most people commute to and from work. But then you have public transit, the bus and rail, but you also have bike-in, walk-in, teleworking, carpool, vanpooling. Teleworking is getting a big chunk of the attention right now. But when we put that in context, only about 5.5% of people telework prior to this. Now, obviously, that percentage has increased significantly since COVID-19, but I think we need to take a more universal approach. I think that's what the DOT is doing, especially here at the CT Rides program, where we're not just focusing on public transit, because in many places across the state, people just don't have access to public transit. So in order for us to reach those folks and appeal to them, we have to find solutions that work for people and work for companies. So I tell everyone that this is a full view that we need to take. Obviously we need roads, we need the highways, the bridges, the expansions. I'm sure the DOT has done a lot of work, a lot of studies to look on the trade-offs with those things. So that's definitely an important component, but so is, again, public transit, the investment in that we've seen with the Fast Track and the Hartford line, which are two overwhelmingly success stories that Connecticut has. And we have a comprehensive carpool, vanpool program as well in the state. So again, I encourage people to really look in the totality of all of the modes and options.
You're hearing Russell McDermott here on Where We Live, Program Director for CT Rides. Joining the conversation now, also on Zoom, is David Dudley. He's editor at City Lab. David, welcome back to the show.
Hi, guy. Thanks for having me.
So we were talking with Russell about how ridership has decreased in our state. Metro North line, 95% drop since March 9th. The Hartford line, an 88% drop. Bus ridership has declined by about half. When we look around the country, David, are these stats in Connecticut and also reflective around other states in our nation?
Absolutely. What we saw in April as these coronavirus lockdowns took effect was just this huge plummeting of ridership numbers across the country. Seattle, New York City, Washington, D.C., cities that have pretty robust transit ridership in general, pre-coronavirus had 60, 70, 80% drops. And those numbers are ticking up now, but most people in the field think that we're looking at least a year perhaps before you are back to where you used to be.
We were talking about the equity issue a little bit earlier. I'm just wondering if you can talk through what we're seeing in especially cities across our country in terms of making sure that not only buses and trains continue to run, but that people feel that it's safe to get to work, David.
Sure. It's an anxious time. We saw so much fear associated with riding public transit during sort of the height of the coronavirus. You had a situation in New York's MTA where a large number of people who work for the MTA were getting sick, were getting infected, and didn't have enough protective equipment. And it was a very anxious time, and I think a lot of people will remain somewhat fearful of getting back on trains and buses. It's important to note that if you look internationally, if you look at cities in Asia and Europe that have very strong public transit ridership, and where also there was sort of a couple of weeks or months of advance experience with COVID-19, we're not seeing huge clusters of infections associated with transit ridership. There was a lot of fear about that, but if you look at Tokyo system and systems in Seoul, there was some data out of France looking at Paris's metro. They're just not seeing that transit and riding buses and subways contributed hugely to infections. What we're seeing is workplaces, congregate living, places where you're in large groups of people in contact with each other for long periods of time. And that you don't see that on transit, assuming everyone is wearing your mask. And that's sort of kind of the key thing is compulsory mask usage from now on public transit.
You mentioned Asia. In Japan, isn't it been fairly common that people wear face masks on transit? Is that part of it, or it's not? People in the United States, some areas, people struggle with having to wear a mask or they don't want to wear a mask. But in other places like Japan, that's pretty common, right?
Yeah, it is. And prior to this, coronavirus incident, there with SARS and MERS, and there have been other epidemics and other infectious disease outbreaks in Asia in the last 10, 20 years. So there is just more of a culture of accepting that it is prudent to wear a mask in an enclosed space or in public, whether or not you're feeling symptomatic. And it took Americans a long time, and it's sort of a work in progress, but it's taking us a long time to sort of get that through our heads that that's effective. And there was mixed messaging from the CDC and so forth. You didn't see that in Asia. So right now, if you're on a subway train in an Asian city, you're wearing a mask, and it would be very unusual to see someone who's unmasked. They also have other sort of scanning and temperature checks and so forth. They were just sort of a little bit more on the ball in terms of being cognizant of the threat that poses. But a lot of this is pretty easy to adopt. It's not rocket science, and it's something that Americans can and will have to get used to.
When we look at these huge drops in ridership, that impacts fare revenue. And so I guess I'm wondering how cities and states are going to be able to keep this essential public service running, especially for people, again, especially bus riders who may not have a car and they need to get to work.
Absolutely. No, it's a huge issue, especially in systems that are very reliant on fare revenue for their funding, which tends to be smaller cities. They don't have a lot of other options. They really do need larger cities is the correct answer there. So like New York, DC, San Francisco relies heavily on the money from fare box pay. So that's a huge issue. They have to keep service up. One of the sort of instructive historical things that a lot of transit advocates point to is after the Great Recession, when a lot of cities were facing very severe budget cuts. A lot of transit agencies cut service during the recession to save money, and it really took a long time for that service to come back, even as the need was evident. And so you don't want to see a situation like that again, where we cut service temporarily during coronavirus lockdowns, and then it never comes back. Because when you cut service, when you cut frequency, you're strictly limiting the usefulness of transit, and you're making it very, very hard to get those riderships back. So a lot of advocates are saying, this is a time when the states and the federal government need to step up with support and keep the service up, because it's desperately needed. This is how people are getting to their essential jobs in cities across the country. So the job of transit now is not really to make money. It's to sort of keep your city alive.
Again, you're hearing David Dudley, who's editor for City Lab here on Where We Live. Also with us is Russell McDermott, Program Director for CT Rides. I'm wondering, watching New York this week, New York City, as again, I believe their phase 1 starts up now, and seeing how many more commuters will be, again, riding the subways, riding the trains, because in the beginning where there was a lot of transmission in the city of New York.
Yeah, you're seeing subway numbers ticking up again, and I think again it's very critical that compulsory mask usage becomes a feature of the subway. It's sort of like like being in an elevator or something like that in your office. You're just going to have to sort of adopt a new set of behavioral norms in order to make this feature of urban life function again.
Russell, I wanted to bring you back into the conversation. When we think again about bus ridership, obviously schedules were tamped down during the start of this pandemic, but as the state continues to reopen, there may be more buses running more frequently, but not having the same capacity as before because of social distancing needing to still be followed?
So I'm not sure exactly what the final plans will look like as they start as we start to reopen more. But again, I want to go back to one point David made, and one I've been echoing is this is not just, we're not just talking about, getting people from point A to point B, or public transportation being a nice to have. Again, this is an integral part of our economy, especially here in Connecticut, and making sure that these services are available to people. Now, on the flip side of that, when we also talk about the health side of it, public transportation, I think for a number of reasons, is really taking a beat, and it's getting a bad rap when you talk about those transmission rates, which I don't know that the data necessarily supports. When you look at your typical person who uses public transportation, what's the real difference between them riding the bus or a traveler sitting on an airplane for several hours, or if you're going into the office and going into an elevator with several people, or in a stairwell? Public transportation, I don't think is any better or worse than any of the routine activities that people are going to have to start returning to. So, I think it's important that we continue to invest in public transportation, and I think it's going to be on the same plane as other activities that people are currently doing and will continue to do.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I'm speaking with Russell McDermott, Program Director for CT Rides, and on Zoom also David Dudley, Editor at CityLab. After the break, we know the environment has benefited from the shutdown over the last few months because less people are driving or flying for business. But is this trend likely to continue? You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, the coronavirus is still around, so as states open back up, the federal CDC has recommended people drive solo to contain the spread of the virus. But that could lead to an increase in carbon emissions and traffic congestion, two things that had improved over the last 3 months. My guests today on Zoom, David Dudley, Editor at CityLab, and Russell McDermott, Program Director for CT Rides. David, what have we seen in other countries who may be past certain phases of the pandemic that we're still in? Are more people avoiding mass transit and just driving in the car by themselves?
Well, perhaps the best examples right now are for what we might be looking at is cities in China, which obviously went through this well before us. And what we're seeing now is a couple of things. One of which is only about half of workers in a lot of Chinese cities have actually gone back to going to the office, even at this rate, even though they've been largely virus-free for a while. And the other thing we saw was sort of a little spike in traffic. A lot of people buying cars, a lot of people getting back on the road as soon as possible. That's something that other cities are very interested in avoiding. So what we saw in European cities like Milan and Paris and so forth, a lot of aggressive efforts to open up streets for bicycles and bike commuting and so forth to try to kind of get in front of the idea that there's going to be a massive surge in vehicle traffic once people get back to work. So we're seeing a little bit of that in American cities. In New York and Oakland and Seattle have opened up a lot of streets and what are called slow streets or open streets, where they're encouraging more people to walk and bike as sort of a commuting alternative, and use this sort of lull in traffic in a kind of a progressive way to try to kind of redraw the kind of the functionality of the urban street grid and make it so that not everybody does have to drive alone.
Mm. We heard from Kate on Twitter, who says she wants to see incentives and infrastructure to support bike commuting. Let's use this opportunity to cut down on single occupancy vehicles on the road. Russell McDermott, I'll go back to you. Again, congestion on Connecticut highways dropped dramatically. Now it's starting to creep back up. Are you worried that with the pandemic and with reopening that we'll see people's driving behavior change and go back to old habits?
Yeah, I'm extremely worried that we're going to see an uptick in the drive alone rates. I think there's going to be a greater and a faster adoption of things like telework, and I think we're going to see the commuting patterns for commuters change, where instead of going into the office 5 days a week, maybe they're teleworking 2 days, going in 3 days, or some mix with transit. But yes, I do think we are going to see an increase in drive alone rates, unfortunately. But again, as I think eventually things will start to balance out, again, we'll see some of that decrease with the increase in teleworking. I think people are going to start coming back to transit. The big question is when and to what degree. That I think is $1 million question. But people who took transit before this, they saw the benefits, they liked it, and prior to the break, I keep hammering the message home off. There isn't that big of a difference between using transit and then going into your typical office building or going into your typical stairwell, or even if you want to draw the comparison of people who take an airplane. And again, I think something we need to acknowledge is transit carried about 80-something million people in Connecticut last fiscal year. And if you just imagine that number and what that would look like on our highways and our roadways and in our big cities like Stamford and New Haven and Hartford and I-91 and I-95, the congestion that would be associated with that if people were to make that sudden shift to only driving alone, again, that's just not something we can support. So I think we need to look at the totality, all of the different resources. So instead of just focusing on teleworking and public transit, we look at it as a broader spectrum where we look at things like carpools and van pools and biking and walking. And we really need to take a universal perspective at looking at this challenge, because currently, according to the last census data I saw, even though public transit moved so many people last year, according to the data, more people traveled by different things like carpooling and vanpooling. So again, I think we need to take a broader, higher level look at this issue.
And David, we just have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to ask you, with this discussion and all of the issues that we've raised and people have been discussing over the last few months, does it change the way our cities will be structured in the future, potentially impacting where people choose to live?
Well, that's another huge question. There are kind of two scenarios, and I think one of which is that we'll see a rejuvenation of the idea that it is important to live closer to your job. That is something that you're seeing a lot of European cities making a case for what's called the 15-minute city, where you can get to your job and your doctor's office and your grocery store and all the sort of the essentials of life within 15 minutes of walking or biking. That is a very kind of a very kind of old school European model of urban living that a lot of Americans don't really experience, because we live in suburbs that tend to be pretty autocentric, and they tend to be pretty sprawling, and you have to kind of drive hither and yon to get to all your stuff. So as we kind of recalibrated our lives during these lockdowns, a lot of people sort of became acutely aware of just what was in their immediate surroundings. They're stuck at home all day, they're taking walks. And, I think there's a scenario that says there'll be a lot of more appetite for the idea that, hey, maybe it would be a lot easier if I just lived closer to my job.
We'll have to leave it there, David Dudley. Thank you, editor at City Lab on Zoom today. Also, Russell McDermott, Program Director for CT Rides. Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.